May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. My husband, Michael, was a fifth grade classroom teacher before he retired. He taught English, math, and social studies. One year, Michael taught a student, we'll call that student Perry, who was the younger brother of a child Michael had taught 2 years earlier. In the middle of that year, as Michael was introducing the novel they were about to read and study for English, Perry recognized it as one his older sister had read in Michael's class just 2 years earlier. Perry then asked, "Mr. Salmon, do you have your class read this book every year?" When Michael said yes, Perry then said, "But don't you get bored reading it every year?" With a smile, Michael said no, and then he explained that he learned something new each time he reread a book because he was in a different place than he had been the year before, and he was reading it with a different group of students who had different insights. In today's gospel passage, we again hear Jesus telling parables. This is the third week in a row of hearing Jesus tell parables. It is the third week in a row of reading from the 13th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. As well, the parables in today's passage are familiar. We know them from reading them in the Gospels of Mark and Luke. As well, because of the cycle of the lectionary, we read this exact passage 3 years ago. One might wonder whether we would get bored of hearing more parables. As you probably know, parables employ metaphorical language, and Jesus used them to teach his listeners about unfamiliar or intangible concepts, in today's case, the kingdom of heaven, by comparing them with something that his listeners already understood and had experience with. Making a connection between the two parts of a parable is what we do when we interpret it. But the elements that Jesus puts together in his parables rarely evoke a simple answer or a singular meaning. Instead, we are drawn to think actively about the elements of the parable, to determine the associations between them, and to make meaning from that. Thus, even when a parable is familiar, we can learn something new, because each time we engage with a parable, we are approaching it with new experiences, additional knowledge, and from a different place spiritually. This allows us to perceive new associations and derive fresh meaning from it. It is like Michael's answer to Perry. We don't get bored. We read and understand the parable in a new way than we had the last time we considered it, because we are in a different place. Let's look at today's passage a little more closely. We have 5 very brief parables, which we hear one right after the other. They are introduced in the same way. The kingdom of heaven is like. And in each parable, the kingdom of heaven is compared to something down to earth, a mustard seed, yeast, a treasure, a pearl, a net full of fish. But unlike last Sunday or the Sunday before, today, no interpretation is given for the parables. We, the listeners, are left to make sense of these comparisons. Additionally, when hearing 5 parables in such rapid-fire succession, it can be difficult to find a focus. How do these diverse items relate? What meaning can we make of all this? On the one hand, each of these parables offers its own piece of information about the kingdom of heaven. At the same time, because we hear the parables as a group, there is also the possibility of making comparisons and associations between the parables. For example, if we can learn about the kingdom of heaven from a mustard seed or from yeast in flour, Is there something we can determine when we think about both of these things together? One association that can be made between those two particular parables is that each contains an element that is hidden. First, we are told that a mustard seed is sown into a field. Jesus states that it is the smallest of all seeds, but then it grows into the greatest of shrubs, so large that birds nest in its branches. But notice, once the mustard seed has been placed into the earth, it is invisible to us. We can't see what it is doing while it is in the earth, is germinating and growing. Yet we know it does those things, even though we can't see them, because we see the result. The seed sprouts and grows into the large, bushy plant. Next, we hear that a woman mixes yeast into 3 measures of flour. Now, our translation says that she mixed the yeast, but a literal translation of the Greek is that she hid it in the flour. And by the way, 3 measures of flour is a very large amount, about 50 pounds. But as with the mustard seed, we have something that we can't see doing its work. There is a small amount of leaven hidden in that very large amount of flour. We know the yeast is there and is active because we notice the result, dough that has risen and expanded. The yeast, invisible to us, does its transformative work, leavening the dough. Even the other parables today contain something hidden once you start thinking about that theme. The treasure is hidden in the field. The pearl is not initially obvious and must be sought by the merchant. The fish are lurking below the surface of the sea. These parables suggest, I think, that God's reign is at work, even when it doesn't appear to be so. It tells us that the kingdom of heaven operates below the surface of things. They assure us that even though we can't always perceive what is happening, God is indeed present and working, just as the seed does in the ground, just as the leaven does in the flour. This idea intrigued me, for we are living in a time when it can feel like God is hidden, unresponsive, and silent. A time when one might look around and see the great suffering and injustice in the world and wonder why God doesn't seem to do anything about them. I've certainly had times when I've wondered why God appears to be so elusive, when I've questioned whether God really is present in this world. Perhaps you too have had times when you have thought the same. If you have, you're not alone. There are a number of saints and well-known Christians who have written of feeling at times in their lives that God was absent from them. Mother Teresa of Calcutta, who ministered to the poorest of the poor in the slums of Calcutta, India, beginning in 1948, is a famous recent example. About 10 years after her death in 1997, it was revealed that she had spent the last 50 years of her life feeling as if she were abandoned by God. Over that long time, she wrote again and again to her spiritual confessors that she could not feel God's presence, despite her many prayers asking God for that. Going back further, the book of Psalms is rife with questions asking where God is. You can find examples of this throughout the Psalms. For instance, from Psalm 10, "Why do you stand so far off, O Lord, and hide yourself in time of trouble?" Or in Psalm 44, "Why have you hidden your face and forgotten our affliction and oppression?" The psalmists are not afraid to make note of their feelings of abandonment and their wondering of why God is not present for them in their troubles. Therefore, when we too are feeling like Mother Teresa or like one of the psalmists, when we are discouraged by the apparently unending destructive nature of human interactions and structures, we have a word of hope from our parables today. They assure us that God is ever present in this world and is always at work, even though our human eyes may not perceive it. These parables remind us to have faith in the hiddenness of God's work, and they prompt us to be on the lookout for the glimmers of God's presence, to look all around for instances when the hidden work of God is made apparent, however briefly that may be. Here are some of the places I have observed these glimmers of God's presence. Perhaps you have found God here as well. In nature, in the midst of community. For me, it is being among you and working alongside you. In silence. At times in worship, a particular line from a hymn or a phrase from a prayer will reveal that glimmer to me. And always I observe God's work whenever I see acts by individuals that make the world more just, no matter how small they might be. You will, of course, have your own examples, but I want to stress that this isn't magic. None of these things will invoke God. But I have found that sometimes I will sense God in them. These glimmers, whenever I perceive them, are why I don't give up in having faith that God is present and working in our world. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed sown in a field. It is like yeast mixed into flour. It is hidden. We can't always observe it, but we can be certain that it is working and transforming everything.